Did you ever take a walk through the woods and listen to the sounds in the forest? The wind in the treetops, the birds chirping high up in the branches, animals scurrying through the leaves that litter the forest floor? Many hundreds of years ago, these would not have been the only sounds you would have heard in the forest. You see, these woods were once home to the first Americans, the Native Americans of the eastern woodlands. You would have heard the sounds of their voices, their music, their songs, their drums, and their lives. Segos can and go. My name is Digali Wakwa. She sings. Or you can call me Joanne Shenandoah. I'm a Native American Wolf Clan member of the Oneida Nation, Iroquois Confederacy. My family and ancestors have lived on this land for thousands of years. Today, I would like to share with you the story of the Woodland Native people. One way we've come to know about early Native American culture is through artifacts dug up by archaeologists. Artifacts are things like pottery, jewelry, and tools. By exploring artifacts left behind, we can learn a lot about what life was like for the first American people. You may wonder, how did the first Americans come to live on this land? Well, one theory scientists propose is that thousands of years ago, much of the northern hemisphere was covered with huge sheets of ice called glaciers. This was the Ice Age. The cold temperatures caused more and more water to freeze, and the level of the oceans dropped. When this happened, a land bridge crossing the sea between Northeast Asia and North America was revealed. Bison, caribou, and other large animals crossed over the bridge, and the Asian people who hunted these animals and depended on them to survive followed. The people settled all over North America and formed groups or nations, becoming the first Native Americans. Some of these people settled in the Pacific Northwest. Others settled in the deserts of the Southwest. Still others settled in the Great Plains. And some people traveled east and settled in what is today known as the northeastern United States, the Great Lakes region, and eastern Canada. The people settled in deep forests, by lakes, rivers, and streams, and lived off the land. Today we call these people the Native Americans of the woodlands. Each woodland nation had its own name. They were called the Algonquin, the Iroquois, the Wampanoag, and the Cree. Each people had their own customs. A custom is a special way a group of people do things, but each shared a common bond, their respect for nature. And nature provided everything the Native American people needed to live. Many different nations settled in the woodlands of North America. They all used the forests, its rivers and resources around them to survive and form their own way of life. The trees of the forest provided them with materials to make homes or shelters to protect themselves from the weather and the animals. One type of home some woodland people built were called wigwams. Wigwams were built out of trees and bark from the surrounding forests. They had a rounded roof and were 10 to 16 feet wide. Their round shape protected them from every kind of weather condition, from rain, wind, and snow. Families would build fires inside their wigwams. The fire was used to heat the home and for cooking too. At the top of every wigwam was a hole for smoke to escape. Wigwams were safe and warm. One or two families called each wigwam their home. Other woodland people built homes that could hold several families. They lived in a larger type of house called a longhouse. A longhouse was also built from trees. A longhouse was supported by long poles and covered with bark from the trees. They too, like wigwams, had rounded roofs, but longhouses were much bigger. Some were 300 feet long. sometimes even longer. Inside a longhouse, there were many fire pits, which kept the longhouses warm and were used for cooking as well. Above each fire pit, there was a hole in the longhouse roof to let the smoke escape. As many as 30 families could live in one longhouse. Each family had their own space to live, sleep, and store their belongings. A longhouse was much like an apartment house you would find today. Woodland people lived together in villages. A village was made up of homes and a central meeting place. Members of the same clan lived in a village. Woodland villages were built near a river or stream, so the people would have easy access to water and fish. A village was a close-knit community, and often there were many villages for each Native American nation. To protect their homes, many woodland peoples built walls around their village. Some constructed palisades. Palisades are walls that are 10 to 12 feet high and made out of wood poles from the forest trees. Palisades had only one entrance and exit. Other woodland people also built their palisades out of poles and woven sticks. Each protected the people of the village against their enemies. Typical Native American families were not large. A basic family unit was made up of a mother, father, children, and grandparents. But in addition to the basic family unit, there were extended families that lived together. It wasn't uncommon for grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, cousins, and siblings to share one longhouse. The home was the center of family life, and everyone in the family had their own job to do to help. The men of the woodlands also had to be skilled at taking materials from the forest and making the tools they needed. Using a small hammer-like tool made from a deer's antlers, men would chip away flint to make sharp arrowheads. Rope, too, was important to Native Americans. The men knew that certain fiber plants that grew wild in the woods would be woven into strong ropes for lashing and tying. The women of the woodlands had many skills as well. They were excellent farmers. They planted seeds and harvested crops. In addition, women took care of the homes and children. At an early age, they learned to make beautiful handcrafted baskets for carrying and storing food. Women also used their weaving skills to make large fish nets for fishing. The women also shaped and molded clay to make pottery that was used for cooking or holding water. And when it came to preparing and cooking the family meals, the women and girls of the family took on that chore as well. Food was cooked over a fire in a clay pot, on stones found in the forest, or roasted on a stick. During harvest seasons, some food was dried and saved for the winter. Much of it was stored in a separate hut or pits, with storage built below the ground where it was much cooler. Now, long ago, Native American children didn't go to school. They learned by watching the grown-ups around them. As soon as they could walk, boys were given toy bows and arrows. Young girls learned the skills of basket weaving, making pottery and clothing, farming and cooking from their mothers. Listening to stories told by the Native elders was also an important part of a child's education. Stories and songs about heroes and their adventures taught children about their past, their culture, and about good morals. Children gathered around their elders and listened to the stories that taught them the Native American way. Native Americans of the woodlands believed that everything had a spirit. Every animal, every tree, every rock. They held ceremonies to honor and thank these spirits. They would sing, dance, and feast inside the longhouse. Drums and rattles were very important in woodland spiritual ceremonies. They were used to get the spirits' attention and to celebrate their honor. The many nations of the eastern woodlands had their own traditions and celebrations and their own ways of dressing, but they all had one very important thing in common. They all depended on the gifts of the forest to survive. Woodland nations like the Algonquin, the Iroquois, the Wampanoag, and the Cree lived in northeast North America for thousands of years. However, when the European settlers came to North America in the 1600s, their lives changed forever. At first, many Native American people welcomed and even helped the settlers. But Native American people did not understand the concept of individual land ownership, and many signed papers that gave their land away to the settlers. Soon, Native American families had lost the lands where they had hunted and fished for generations. Some Native Americans tried to fight back, but their weapons were no match for guns. Many Native Americans died. The Native American nations that once lived throughout the woodlands were killed in battles with the settlers or died from disease. As many as 90% perished in various plagues. Survivors were pushed out of their homes and forced to live on reservations, land set aside for Native Americans only. It's important to know and understand the fascinating history of Native American people. It's a story of the past. But it's also important to realize that today, many Native Americans don't live on reservations. They live in towns and cities just like you, and their lives are not much different than other Americans. What truly is important is that Native American people preserve their customs, culture, and spirituality, just like other American families preserve the customs and cultures passed down from their parents and grandparents. And even though the lifestyle of today's Native Americans has changed, they know the value of teaching the truth of their ancestors, the first Americans.